Institutionalization is an integral aspect of the Gramscian notion of the hegemony because institutions, whether political, military, or socio-economic, provide a systemic legitimacy for dealing with conflicts either coercively or through peaceful means. The underlying structure of interstate relations intrinsically involves an enforcement potential under the control of the powerful nations. The consequence is two distinct forms of great power, weak state relations, coercive and consensual. In the latter sense, it is the condition whereby strong states exercise leadership over weak states by gaining their perennial consent. To a large extent, the use of force is obviated to the point that the developing state submits to the prevailing power relations. Continuous submission is enhanced by the fact that the dominant states are willing to make concessions, implement policy adjustments that from time to time help to alleviate the politico-economic burdens of the weak states. Institutions provide a legitimacy of power relations, articulate the hegemonic mission of the powerful, and appeal for the cooperation of the weak. For example, images of proper global economic relations have been institutionalized and universalized by institutions like the IMF, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, World Trade Organization, and the World Bank, among others. Similarly, institutional provision for dealing with intractable and extensive conflict situations is located within the jurisdiction of the United Nations Security Council and more recently within regional security organizations like NATO and the Economic Community of West African States. Developments are underway to make regional organizations like the Organization of African Unity, the Organization of American States, and so on more responsive to peacekeeping interventions. Thus, hegemony, which comprises of both coercive and consensual relations, help to cement and legitimize and internationalize the dominant moral and cultural values, and disseminates the worldview of the dominant states. The hegemonic functions of the great powers, with the consent of the weak states, create functional unity in a system of diversity. To a large extent, then, subordinate states either give unwilling consent or voluntary consent to the social logic imposed on specific issues by the strong states. Accordingly, social forces that commence within the powerful states soon spill over into weak states, and the policy implications or adaptive mechanisms that accompany them imposed upon or integrated into the political economy of these weak states. The socio-political developments produced by the dynamics of the economic system in turn generate institutions and policy changes that determine world orders. Stated differently, economic crisis and political transformations generate new policy imperatives and or social forces, which in turn bring about changes in the structure of states and the relationship with civil society. For example, the transnational social forces unleashed by both the Cold War competition and post-Cold War era influence state structures in both the core and periphery. In other words, changes in systemic polarity spawn forces that influence state structures, underscoring the fact that state structures are largely a reflection of a particular structure of world order and forces in existence. A world hegemony in this sense is thus the expansive effects of the individual and collective social forces of the dominant advanced industrial states. The IFIs, the culture, the technology and other entities associated with this collective hegemony constitute guidelines for development models in developing states. The dominant effects of such a collective hegemonic system also becomes a demonstration effect which could have a profound effect on the lives of groups in poor countries. Which of the following options, if true, would best exemplify the reference to the great power weak state relations? Now, if we go back to the passage, we notice that the first paragraph discusses the elements of the great power weak state relations. Here, lines 5-14 of the first para spell out the aspects of this relationship. Option A, as given here, is a form of consensual relationship that can be inferred From lines 7-8, strong states exercise leadership over weak states, and lines 10-12, dominant states are willing to make concessions, trade subsidies. So your answer is going to be choice A. Option B is incorrect because it is not a form of coercive or consensual form of power, because there is a lack of autonomy for the weak state in either form. Option C is not a form of the great power weak state relation because there is no element of control that can be determined from this relation. Option D is a form of mutual dependence and not strong weak relationship. In this situation, both parties seem to be on equal platform. Your answer is going to be A. It can be inferred that the purpose of institutions like the IMF is to, let's go back to this passage and see where the IMF is mentioned. It's mentioned, in fact, in the second half of the first paragraph. Here. It says that that the IMF plays a certain role in world politics. IMF ensures that global economic relations have been institutionalized and universalized. It provides institutional provision for dealing with intractable and extensive conflict situations, etc. Now, the first sentence of the paragraph also states that institutions provide a systemic legitimacy, authenticity required to deal with conflicts, whether coercively or peacefully. So, as a result, let us see which of these choices given here best fulfill the purpose of institutions like the IMF. In fact, it can only be D for delta, which is to provide a systemic authenticity to and to universalize the relationship between dominant and weak states. What's wrong with A? It is incorrect because it does not make a reference to a hegemonic world order. Option B does not discuss the relationship between the dominant and weak states. And C is incorrect because the last part of the paragraph states that these institutions help to cement and legitimize the world view of dominant states and not the relationship between the dominant and weak states. So your answer is going to be D for delta. What does the author mean when he states in the last sentence of the second paragraph, the underscoring the fact that state structures forces in existence? Let's go back to the last sentence of the second paragraph. Now, if you read this carefully, the second sentence indicates that social forces of powerful states eventually influence the forces in the weak states. In fact, when we talk about changes in systemic polarity, spawn forces that influence state structures, underscoring the fact that state structures are largely a reflection of a particular structure of world order and forces in existence. Now, these lines, as given here, talks about social forces of powerful states eventually influence the forces in weak states. It certainly does. They also influence the structure of states in general. The last sentence concludes that changes in the world bring about a change in the, say, state structure. However, the change that is brought about is indicated to be influenced by the dominant states itself. Hence, option B is the answer here. The composition and function of state structures is influenced by the social forces of dominant states. So, B is definitely the answer. Option A is incorrect because the paragraph states that social forces influence state structures in both the core, the dominant state, and the periphery, the weak state. The passage does not refer to core and peripheral transnational forces. Option C refers to the need for a structural analysis. However, this need has not been discussed in the passage. Option D can be broadly inferred from the passage. However, it cannot be inferred from the last sentence of the second paragraph. So your answer is going to be B for Bravo. Given the information in the passage, which of the following statements must be true? Now, if you look at the four choices, and we have already read the passage closely, we can say that option A is not correct because there isn't enough information to infer that a developed state's sovereignty cannot be assailed, cannot be violated or attacked. Even though the passage indicates that it is the social forces in a dominant nation that influence forces in a weak nation, one cannot infer that a developed state cannot be influenced by another or that its sovereignty can't be threatened. Option B again can't be inferred because the intensity of hegemony in various state structures has not been discussed in the passage. The first paragraph indicates that peacekeeping is a hegemonic function. It even states that it is institutionalized and within the jurisdiction of the United States Security Council. Option C can thus be inferred. So if you look at C, it is something we've been reading about in the passage, that peacekeeping is a hegemonic function, especially in the substantive shift from traditional intervention to a new variation. D is incorrect because it does not specify that this is true for dominant states or for the great power states. So your answer is going to be C for Charlie.